Hi, everyone, and welcome to Wild Washington Live, Endangered Species of Washington. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Leah Althauser, and I use she and her pronouns. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the traditional and ancestral lands of the Nisqually peoples, who have been caretakers of this land since time immemorial. To learn more about the Nisqually tribe and the work that they do, please see the link in the chat. This program is part of our Wild Washington education program. Wild Washington offers lessons, events, and other fish, wildlife, and natural resource theme education. Last week, we published a lesson, a middle school lesson on endangered species. So if you would like to teach that lesson or learn more about it, please see the link in the chat. A couple of quick housekeeping things. We have enabled closed captioning, but if you would like to turn it off, please click the button in the lower right-hand corner of your toolbar with the 2 C's, and you'll see the option for turning off the subtitles. We won't be taking verbal questions, so raised hands will not be called on. However, if you have a question, please submit it to us in the Q&A. Now, I'm super excited to introduce our presenter today. Hannah Anderson is our Wildlife Diversity Division Manager, and her work involves species that are not included, that are non-game species. And so she'll tell you a lot more about that. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Leah. I'm super happy to be here. I'm gonna share my screen and talk you all through some of the work that we do in my division of DFW. Oh, and it did the thing that I was hoping it wasn't going to do. Sorry, 1 second. Almost there. Okay, I got it worked out. All right, I'm Hannah, and I'm going to talk to you today about listed species. And Leah already said it, the non-game wildlife, or the diversity species, my division is called, are sort of all the group of wildlife that are not hunted or fished. And so that ranges from insects like this island marble butterfly, all the way through to the big critters like grizzly bears, and including the amphibians and the reptiles and the small mammals and the large mammals and the birds. So it's kind of a big group. I like to think about it as just wildlife. I did my best to caption the critters when I had them throughout the presentation, and it's pretty picture heavy. So hopefully I did that. I know I missed a few, but I'll give you a go. So first, just quickly about WDFW and our mission, and I'm guessing many of you already know this, but our mission is to preserve, protect, and perpetuate the fish, wildlife, and ecosystems, while also providing sustainable fish and wildlife recreation and commercial opportunities. So that's all the way from angling opportunities, providing public access so people can get to see the wild places and access the wild places, to providing hunting opportunities, and also other recreational opportunities, and just managing the other wildlife. This here is a Wilson's warbler and Western pond turtle. Looks like I missed the captions already. So that's sort of the broad suite. And then my work and the work of our division and the work of our agency has a lot of wildlife biologists. And maybe you've seen this, it's floating about on the internet, but it just sort of cracks me up because it's sort of true, for all the way from what my friends think maybe a wildlife biologist is, or like a wildlife ranger, all the way through to a tree protector, to the people that actually are out there in the landscape, working with the critters, to this person in the bottom right. And swear to gosh, this really is a lot of my work. I do a lot of meetings and emails and talking about the management of our wildlife. And so, boy, I did used to be in the field But as I progressed in my career, ultimately now I get to work with a lot of people that still are in the field and support the amazing work that they do. And thank goodness that they're doing it. And here are just a few images of our amazing wildlife biologists out there on the ground, working with the critters and supporting their populations. And I'll sort of talk you through some of that work. So I know I was asked to talk about endangered species, and I will, but I wanted to start us with that broad sweep, right? Endangered species, when I think about them, those are the critters that are in such dire trouble. They're in such trouble that they're sort of like in the emergency room. And the best way to conserve and protect wildlife is to keep them out of the emergency room in the first place. So a lot of the work we do can be aimed at keeping common species common and creating habitat conditions that continue to support them. And many of these critters that I'm sure you're familiar with, like American robins, are in your yard, I bet, garter snakes, the chorus frogs in the bottom right, that is my yard. Those are my roses right outside my front door. So everything we can do to support the wildlife to keep the common species common so that they don't become endangered that's like task number one. So once we move from the common species, WDFW has another big group of critters. There are 268 species in Washington state that are identified as species of greatest conservation need. And that list includes animals that maybe we don't know enough about, where we don't know how well they're doing, but we have some indication that perhaps maybe their habitat might be impacted or a little bit in trouble, and we think, gosh, that critter may have maybe in need, and so we need to learn more about that, all the way to we have a pretty good indicator that these critters are declining and they're in trouble, but maybe they're not so in trouble that they warrant listing, but we better keep an eye on it and do everything we can to maintain them as so they don't get to that place. Again, keeping them out of the emergency room is really important. So yeah, the common species, we've got our SGCN, the species of greatest conservation need, and then we move into our listed species. And the goal here is to identify those animals that are in the most trouble, so we know that they're there, so that we can then work on recovery. So identify and restore those listed species to healthy populations within a large piece of their historic range in the state, so that we can keep them on the landscape. And some of these critters, I'm guessing you've heard of, like the northern spotted owl, or maybe even the pygmy rabbit, and some maybe you haven't heard of, like the Taylor's checker spot. Or maybe you've heard of northern leopard frog, but didn't realize that they were in trouble. And that's true. Northern leopard frogs in much of the United States are abundant or common, but here in Washington have declined to a place where we have just one wild population left. And so they made it onto our list here in the state, and we want to make sure we don't lose them. So the list, the endangered species list, it can be called, but really we have three statuses, three things on our endangered species list, and they range from the most critical, the intensive care unit, all the way through to in the hospital, but not all the way in real trouble. So endangered species, where we have 29 of those on our list. 9 that are then threatened, so likely to become endangered, and 8 that are sensitive, so they're vulnerable and declining and may become endangered or threatened if we don't remove the threats or address the threats that are threatening them. And you'll notice from all these pictures that the diversity of endangered species sort of reflects the diversity in our state too, the wildlife diversity. We've got marine species like whales, we've got amphibians, and like the Oregon spotted frog or the large mountain salamander, sage grouse, birds, grizzly bear, modern skipper butterfly, Taylor's checker spot butterfly, western pond turtle. All of these critters sort of span all the taxa, or all the different kinds of wildlife. So 46 are state listed in our state. So how do we manage that, or how does that happen? We assess their status, like have to understand how many are there, where are they, and how are they doing? What is the distribution, the abundance, and their trend? You know, is their population increasing or is it decreasing through time? These here are large mountain salamanders, and those are some of our biologists out in the field getting wet and looking for salamanders, and then collecting data that we can then inform our actions. So understanding how the populations are doing is one of the most important things we do. And then really identifying, well, what is threatening them? Why, how did they get to this place? And so I assume it comes as no surprise that habitat loss, habitat degradation, fragmentation of habitat, conversion of habitat from one kind to another, or say from grassland to farmland, or into housing developments. This is one of our biggest drivers and biggest threats to endangered species here in Washington and elsewhere. Also, even natural threats like predation can be a real problem for small populations of critters. Disease can also be a major threat. These are western pond turtles, that picture on the right, where we're that are threatened by a shell disease that creates these sores on their shells. And we're working really hard to try to figure that out and reverse it. The small population size itself can create new problems. So the bird on the right there sitting on her nest is a streaked horned lark. And there is a very small population in Washington and really throughout its range. And because of its small population size, we're very concerned about genetic issues affecting their reproduction. And in this case, we were worried about them affecting all their eggs weren't hatching. So they would lay eggs, but not all of them would hatch. And so that kind of thing can happen, a genetic problem. And this picture on the left is just a picture of wildfire, that when your population is very small, and a wildfire could come through and really severely impact your whole population if there's only so many of you. And so the small populations themselves can be a threat or a risk to sort of even some natural occurrences like wildfire. So what do we do about that? We identify these threats, we understand where the populations are and how they're doing. And then we have to invest in recovery actions, and sort of the complement to the habitat loss and degradation being one of the major threats. One of the biggest things we can do is to protect and restore habitats. So to keep them in a natural state, or to keep them with the conditions that the critters need, right? So that they have the food that they need, or they have the shelter that they need, and that each animal may have some very specific requirements. So we do a lot of habitat protection and restoration work. And then complementing that, we also, when you're dealing with endangered species, it takes some of that fine scale work that includes species specific actions. And one of those is our reintroductions. So bringing animals back to places where they no longer occur. And all these critters here on the screen either have an active or have had in the past reintroduction or augmentation programs. Augmentation just means bringing more animals to a place to make a population bigger. Or more robust. So the pygmy rabbit is one of our most critically endangered species in our state, occurs in the Columbia Basin, and we have a very long-standing and active reintroduction program for pygmy rabbits. Taylor's checker spot butterfly occurs on the west side. Again, a long-standing captive rearing and reintroduction program. Northern leopard frog and sage grouse. All of these things we've actively worked to increase population sizes and numbers. And then I'll just quickly show you what some of that looks like. This is our western pond turtle. You'll notice that little red thing on her back, that's an adult female, and that little red thing is a transmitter. so that we can follow her around and find where her nest is. You know, they burrow down and they lay their eggs in a burrow and then cover that back up. So we locate where that is, and it's under that little X. And then we put a mesh cage over it, not to keep the turtles in, they can still, the little babies can get out, but to keep the predators from getting in and eating them. And then we also have a head starting program where we bring some eggs from the wild and bring them to the zoo, the Woodland Park Zoo or the Oregon Zoo, and they work to hatch them out and grow them up so that they're big enough to be able to be released back in the wild and not be eaten by things like bullfrogs. That's my son right there at a Western pond turtle release. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into another case study of the fisher. It's a big weasel, and that's native to our state. And weasels, this fisher eats small mammals, from all the way from deer mice to porcupines. Fishers eat porcupines. Can you imagine eating a porcupine? It just amazes me every time I think about it. And they use forests. They live their whole lives in forests, and they den in holes in trees, and they have their babies in there, and they find their food there, and they sleep there, and they're active all year. And they eat not only just any forest, but these large forested landscapes. And we have that here in Washington. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, their pelt, or their fur, was really valuable, and they were trapped for their pelt that would be sold, and it wasn't regulated until about the mid 30s when it was outlawed. And even though that happened, the fishers never rebounded. They were what's called extirpated, which just means they were locally extinct. So they're extinct in Washington. So here we were in this situation where we had the forests. This is a map of Washington state, and those gray areas are forested areas that we thought had good habitat for fishers, but we didn't have any fishers. So we had the habitat, we had the forest, but we didn't have the fishers. So what do? Well, we work with our partners in Canada to collect animals that are from a population that's doing well up to the north in British Columbia and later in Alberta. And we brought those animals down to Washington. After they were captured in Canada, we take them to the vet, make sure they're healthy and doing well. And remember that little red thing that you saw on the fish or on the turtle? For the fishers, we can't glue it to their carapace because they don't have one of those. But instead, that little thing on the bottom left corner is a tracker. And so they insert the tracker inside the animal's body so that we can find it later. And then we transport those fishers. Each one of those boxes that those folks are carrying is a fisher inside there. And then we let them go because we knew that we had the habitat and we know that the fishers can go and do their thing. And so that's what we did. We brought a whole bunch of fishers from Canada and we let them go. And then we flew around and used the little signal that came out of the tracker to figure out where they went. And this is a map from above. Those lines on the left are the paths that the airplane went. And then those dots on the right-hand side are where the fishers were located. And you see that little green box that's on the right-hand side of the map? That is Mount Rainier National Park, just to orient you. So we released fishers in the South Cascades, and we later released them in the North Cascades, and before that, we released them in the Olympics. And then we're trying to figure out where they are, and we're trying to learn about, are they reproducing? Can we see them sort of staying in one place, and then we can go in and see if we can find their den and see if we can find the young, or put remote cameras up so we can hear the young or see the young on the cameras. And we also look for if they're living or dying, and if they are dying, how or why. And we do, that's our veterinarian, try to figure out what happened. The good news is that we have reached our founder population goals. And so it's super exciting. This has been a long-term project, many years, and we've hit our initial goals for releases. And we know that in many places they are reproducing and enough for surviving that we think will be a good founder population. This picture, that guy right there, that's Jeff Lewis. He's the lead biologist that works for us, and he's been engaged in this project for many years, and he's great to has a wealth of knowledge. Anyway, so we are with our founder populations, and we're going to be doing some camera trapping or remote camera sensing in the next year or so to really understand our population, but we're aiming for a wide-ranging, self-sustaining population in our forested landscapes, and we think we're on our way there. It's really cool, exciting. So just a note about looking to the future. Recovery of endangered species takes a long time. It's, I mentioned that Fisher program has been going for at least 10 years. Our pygmy rabbit program has been going 15 years. Our checker spot program has been going at least 15 years. It takes a long time, and there are no shortcuts. You can't just make it happen. The other thing is that the threats to not just our endangered species, but wildlife and all of us are serious. There's really some serious things out there, especially those human-caused threats like climate change and all the things that come with that, sea level rise, or missed interactions between insects and plants and birds, or increased wildfire, having more and hotter fires. The threat of habitat loss continues to happen, and this continues to be a problem. And pollution, another one. I didn't talk about that really at all, but it's a big concern. And so it's really better to keep species from being endangered so that we don't have to work through this really intensive and expensive and long-term recovery actions. So what can you do? You can help too. Here's my daughter holding a gopher snake. Get outside and get involved and learn about the wildlife, just like all of you are doing right now, and then share what you know with others. You can volunteer. There are volunteer options, not just with the department, but with many organizations throughout the state. You can work to create habitat at home or wherever you live. And the department's got some guidance on that. You can choose to spend and eat wisely and do things to shrink our footprints. So, organic foods or locally sourced, those kinds of things. And there's a lot of folks out there to help guide you down that direction. I probably went over, but that's it. Thank you. And I'll stop screen sharing so you can see me bigger maybe.
Anna, that was wonderful. I learned so much. Thank you. So we do have a few questions for you. If you have a question and you haven't asked Hannah already, please put it in the chat. So our first one is, are sunflower sea stars on the endangered species list?
They're not on our state list, no.
Our second question is, what is the founder population numbers for the Fisher?
It depends on which piece, so we have 3 recovery areas. And so there was the Olympics, the Olympic Mountains, and I believe the target number was 90, which were released. And then there's the South Cascades and North Cascades recovery areas. And I believe those numbers were 80 released animals in each of those areas. And then the other really important metric is are they reproducing? Do we have evidence of reproduction? So have we seen a baby? Or have we learned through genetics or something later that they are reproducing?
Perfect. And then one that goes off of that is, what does it mean to be a founder population?
Yeah, I guess I just mean that it's the group of animals that we initially brought that we hope will expand and create a bigger population.
Thank you. The picture of the fisher looked like it was denning in a lightning tree. Is that a common occurrence? Just thinking about areas that have higher frequency of lightning strikes might be good habitats. I wonder what the tribal stories say about fishers.
Oh, I do too. I don't know the answer to that second piece. I don't know if it was a lightning tree or not, but certainly it's a tree that has a cavity, right? And so snags or dead trees or partially impacted trees would create those cavities that would be that fishers, find and then use to, have babies in.
Cool. Where are Western gray squirrels at on the list, or what is their roadmap to recovery look like?
Yeah, Western gray squirrels are, they are on the list. They're, I believe they're threatened species, so they're state threatened. And we're working on a status review right now to sort of assess that. So I don't have the sort of trigger recovery actions in my mind, but certainly habitat protection is one of those big pieces. And so we're learning as much as we can about them and doing an assessment right now of their status.
Good. Can you please expand on eating wisely?
Yeah, sure. I guess what I mean there personally is just about making the choices I can about locally sourced foods or organic foods that aren't using pesticides or insecticides, and sort of I prefer to choose this, me personally, just sort of trying to support small scale farmers in my local area. I certainly engage. I love the farmers market there a lot, to try to shrink my footprint and how I operate.
Wonderful, thank you. What is the process for getting a species added to either the state or federal endangered species list?
Yeah, kind of there's sort of two ways to do it. There can, the department, we make assessments and make recommendations that then go to the Fish and Wildlife Commission for a decision. So our biologists would notice that there's a species that is of concern, and we do have actually a candidate list. I didn't talk about that, but there is a list of candidate species where sort of next up for potential listing, and then we make a recommendation and it goes to the Fish and Wildlife Commission, and then they would make a decision whether to list, not to list, to upgrade, downgrade, all that. That's all in their decision-making space. And then there's also anybody can petition the department to list a species, and then that also initiates that same process.
Thank you. So if I was just the average person and I thought a species was struggling, I could petition the department to look into it more?
Yes. Yeah, and there's a sort of process of the things that would be included.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What about invasive species? Are they a
Man.
threat to endangered species?
Yes, holy mackerel, are they ever? Yeah, endangered species, or sorry, invasives, both the plant and animal variety are a real problem. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them, so the cheatgrass is a grass invading on the eastern side of our state and really compromising our shrub steppe habitats. So not only sort of pushing out the natives and outcompeting the natives, but also creating conditions that make the habitat burn hotter and faster than would be in a more native system. And then I'll give you an animal example. Bullfrogs are an invasive species, and in the case of the western pond turtle, as well as our endangered Oregon spotted frogs, where the bullfrogs and the endangered critters co-occur or live together in the same place. The bullfrogs, boy, they eat everything. They eat everything, anything that can fit in their mouth, they just eat it. And so we've, many times documented western pond turtles, Oregon spotted frogs, northern leopard frogs, inside bullfrogs. Yeah, it is a bummer. Invasives are, that was a great question. Invasives are a real problem.
So you were talking about cheatgrass just a minute ago, and pygmy rabbits live in shrub steppe where cheatgrass are. Or how many pygmy rabbits do you think are left in Washington?
It's a pretty small number, and we don't know exactly how many there are because critters are hard to count. But we do annual surveys in the areas where we've released pygmy rabbits and historic areas. And we think, less than 300, probably in the maybe 100 place right now. The wildfires that have happened just in 2020 took out an entire recovery area. So we have 3 main recovery areas for pygmy rabbits, and I think it was the Cold Springs fire. Completely impacted and removed that entire recovery area and all the rabbits living there. So that was that was hard. But just recently, our biologists in the field did locate 2 new occurrences or places where pygmy rabbits are living, and really great partnerships with some private landowners, and that's really heartening, although still there's a really small number of pygmy rabbits.
So they still need a lot of help.
They do. They still need a lot of help.
I've heard of wolverines sighted at Mount Rainier National Park. Do they compete with fishers, and how are wolverines faring?
So do they compete with fishers? I'm going to say no, but I am not the expert on that. So remember that guy I showed you earlier, Jeff Lewis. He's our mesocarnivore biologist and could speak way more knowledgeably to answer that question than me. And then how are wolverines doing? They are on our candidate list, and so we're looking at that. Getting information about critters like that who live in rugged terrain and are few in number just naturally is really challenging. And so it's hard to know exactly how, we can't always count the animals is really the bottom line, and have to use surrogates to sort of give us indication of how well they may be doing.
Is there any consideration in the question, is there any consideration of the moral questions in captive breeding programs when climate/habitat stability isn't good? A lot of stress for individual animals when there may not be a lot of viable habitat.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always ethical considerations, and for all of our work, and certainly the the concern about the animals in captivity. You're right, it is stressful, and we really take that very seriously. And everything we do, everything we can do, we do to sort of minimize that stress and make it as easy of a process as possible. As far as the sort of forward-looking climate change scenario, I mean, we wouldn't engage in a project if we didn't think it wasn't feasible to have a viable wild population. And so we do think about things like that and take it very seriously, because not only for the individual's welfare, but for the sort of the resources, the cost it takes to do this kind of work is pretty intense. And so we want to be really responsible in our actions.
And Hannah, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't we have a team that sort of assesses how species will do in climate change? Is that a way that we allocate resources?
Yeah, so we do sort of climate vulnerability assessments, and in our state wildlife action plan, there are identified sort of species that may be most vulnerable to climate change, and so we do absolutely think about that, and we do have a climate change coordinator in our agency, and I think we're really it's really good that we do have that, and certainly climate change is. I mean, it's always comes up in every wildlife management conversation I'm ever in. And so we certainly are thinking about it and trying to be smart in our allocation of resources and be forward thinking in how we look to manage in the future.
What about giant hogweed? Is it a threat?
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to look that one up.
Research time.
Yeah, exactly. Stumper.
Habitat question. Excuse me. Is the process of limbing up evergreen trees on forest land a process that is harmful to endangered species?
So I'm not a forester either. It probably depends on the which critter, right? So the conditions of each critter, and it depends on this sort of the health of the forest overall, and what's the objective of the limbing. So I think that's a really complicated and probably nuanced. I don't have a like bing, oh yeah, that's good or bad. I think it probably depends. And I think I would say in general, limbing is not, I'm just not going to say either thing because I don't know the answer.
More research opportunities.
These questions are hard. You guys are good.
Can you give some examples of mistimings of animals and plants? For example, bumblebees and huckleberries. So like phenology.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the kind of example where you have, because insects and plants have, their own life cycles and emerge. So I'll give you the example with an endangered species. I'll give you because it's the one I know the best. So our Taylor's checker spot butterfly uses very specific plants to lay their eggs, very few and specific plants to lay their eggs on. And then the eggs, they come out as little teeny tiny caterpillars. And then they sleep until the spring. And then in the spring, when the plants start to green up, the little teeny tiny caterpillars, the larvae, come out and start eating. And they only eat that really young, fresh plant. And so and I would imagine two butterflies I know, specifically two endangered ones, do that. And so if the plant is emerging at a different time and isn't in that young, really tasty, little soft new leaves at the time that the larvae emerge, then they're not going to have anything to eat and will starve. And so it's sort of that kind of interaction that's a problem. Or if you've got bird migration that is timed, is the timing is off, then they wouldn't be, food resources available or something like that.
How were the sage grouse affected by last summer's wildfires?
Yeah. We think that about 50% of the sage grouse occupied area where they were living was burned through. And of course the burn, is variable. Some places burned really hot and some not so hot. We're doing our surveys, our spring surveys right now. And what we're learning, although we're not complete, is that many of the breeding age adults did survive the fire, but the numbers we're counting are lower, substantially lower than last year, which was already pretty low. And then the other thing we're very concerned about is that the understory, so the sage grouse live in, the shrub steppe with the sage shrubs, but they're really dependent on this understory of forbs or wildflowers and grasses, and the fire burned through much of that. And so that's where they nest. And if they don't have that understory, then we're worried about their ability to reproduce successfully. And so we're concerned that we're seeing some population decline right now, and we're concerned we're going to see even more next year. So
a lot of work to be done.
Yes, indeed.
How low does an animal population have to be for it to be considered endangered?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you want to think about it like that, but it kind of isn't like that. I'm going to give you the famous scientist answer of it depends. Some populations, like an insect population, maybe you get to 10,000 and that's enough to be endangered. And some populations, 100 and they're endangered. It depends on the life history of the animal, right? So I'll give you a few examples of current known populations. So streaked horned larks, I mentioned, we think there are some, 2,000 to 3,000 of them range wide, and in Washington, much less. We just listed a species of the Oregon Vesper sparrow that occurs in Washington, and we think there are some, 300 to 600 here in the state. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with the southern resident killer whales. There are, some 70, what's my number, 76 now, with a couple of babies recently born. So it's not, you don't just hit a number and go, that's how many there are, and it's endangered. It's more like, what are the threats that are affecting that population? And is it in decline? And are we seeing it go down? And so, yeah, it's not always about a number, but not enough.
A very complex question.
It is. It seems like it'd be simple, but it just isn't.
We have just a few more questions for you, Hannah.
Okay.
Our next one is, how many leopard frogs are estimated to be left in Washington?
Oh, I should know that one. I hesitate to say it. I want to look it up and pass it to you, because we did just do a census and genetic assessment. So there's one wild occurrence near Moses Lake, and then we're working on a reintroduction program to establish them nearby in another population. I don't want to give you the answer because I don't know what the number is off the top of my head.
And
Sorry.
so if they wanted to find out later, is there somewhere on our website that they could find that out?
I don't know that it's published on our website, but I will answer it and get it back to you. Can you help me do that, Leah?
Yep, definitely.
Okay.
I will put in my chat my email, and if you want to email me your question, I will make sure Hannah can answer that for you.
I will answer that question. I know the answer, I just don't know it. We know the answer.
Okay, our second to last question is, I want to help with Western pond turtle recovery. What can I do? Yeah,
there are things you can do. You can get engaged with the Woodland Park Zoo. They have their volunteer opportunities there. There's volunteer opportunities with us to help. One of the things that we sometimes need help with is driving the eggs or the hatchlings to and from the zoo. I mean, there's lots of opportunities. So yes, I think there are things that folks can help with Western pond turtles.
And our last question for you today is, how did you get to be involved in your work with endangered species? And if you were a student interested in having your job someday, what steps would you recommend they take to get there?
Yeah, that's always a good one. How did I get here? I sort of took a weird path. I didn't really get into wildlife until I was in college, and then I was an anthropology major, and I started studying primates, monkeys, and apes, and that sort of led me down this path to wildlife. And then eventually I went and got a master's degree and in environmental studies, and I did some internships with folks. I did an internship with Mount Rainier, and I did some work with a biologist. A DFW researcher came to my school and gave a presentation, and I followed up with him and was like, I don't know, I'm interested in that, and can I help you? And eventually I got sort of a technician job working with streaked horned larks. And so my first sort of work in wildlife was with an endangered species. And so that's sort of how I came through it. And then I worked in nonprofit. I worked for the Nature Conservancy for a while doing endangered species recovery facilitation, or sort of working with people. And eventually I got a job at DFW. I would recommend doing just the things you just asked about, like whoever did, about the volunteering, engage with, and there's a lot of local nonprofits that do a lot of really great work, that there are a lot of volunteer opportunities. And I'm sure we could provide some of that, who to connect with, but do those internships, talk to people, ask questions, and start just sort of scratching at people that are already working in it, and can sort of point you towards where those opportunities are. AmeriCorps, people have done, I've known a lot of folks that have gotten into wildlife work through programs like AmeriCorps. So that kind of thing, internships, volunteer.
Getting involved and getting hands-on is important.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I just want to remind everyone that a recording of today's Wild Washington event will be on the WDFW YouTube channel in about a week. If you had questions that didn't get answered, we had quite a few of them. I apologize. Feel free to send them to the email I popped in the chat, and I will kindly ask Hannah to help me out. We also just put in some more information on the northern leopard frog in the chat as well. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really wonderful, and I know I've learned a lot, and I hope that our viewers have as well.
It was super fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right, bye.
Bye.